I've been a park ranger for over a decade, working in various parts of the country. I've seen my fair share of strange happenings, but nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced in the Smoky Mountains National Park. The stories about that place, the whispers, the warnings, I never took them seriously. That was my mistake. It all started when some of my colleagues insisted I visit the park. They spoke of its beauty and the serenity it offered. They said it would be a great escape from my usual assignments. At first, I hesitated. I had heard about some strange occurrences there, unexplained noises, missing people, and even rumors of a mysterious presence. But I brushed it off. After all, I was a professional. I'd dealt with wild animals, intense weather, and even the occasional lost tourist. How bad could it be? I should have known better. When I first set foot in the Smoky Mountains, everything seemed normal. The forest was dense, shrouded in mist, and the air was thick with moisture. The trees towered overhead, their leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. I felt a sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in a long time. The calmness was almost too perfect, but as the day wore on, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, a strange sensation like being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Every now and then, I'd hear a twig snap or a low growl in the distance, but when I looked, nothing was there. I shrugged it off as my imagination. It wasn't until I ventured deeper into the park that things truly took a turn. I came across a small cabin, tucked away in a secluded area. It looked abandoned, overgrown with vines, as if no one had lived there for decades. But there was something about it that called to me. Maybe it was my curiosity, or maybe it was the feeling of being drawn into something I didn't understand. I approached cautiously, my hand resting on my rifle just in case. Inside, the air was stale, and the floorboards creaked underfoot. As I explored, I found strange symbols etched into the walls, symbols I didn't recognize. The further I ventured into the cabin, the colder it got. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the kind of cold that sank into your bones, the kind that made your skin crawl. Then I found it, a journal. It was old, the pages yellowed with age, but it was still legible. The entries were disjointed, written by someone who was clearly losing their grip on reality. The writer spoke of something in the mountains, a presence that had been there long before the park was established. They mentioned the vengeful spirits, the ones who didn't want anyone disturbing the land. According to the journal, anyone who entered their territory would be cursed, their fate sealed. The more I read, the more I felt my heart race. This wasn't just some old tale. It felt real. I left the cabin in a hurry, but the feeling of being watched never left. The mist seemed to close in around me, and the familiar sounds of the forest now felt ominous, as if the trees themselves were watching. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, heavy, deliberate steps that mirrored my own. When I turned around, there was no one there, but the air felt heavier, suffocating. I quickened my pace, but the footsteps kept following me, and then I saw it. At the edge of my vision, something moved. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, and its eyes glowed an unnatural red. I froze, heart pounding in my chest. The thing didn't move toward me, but it didn't leave either. It just stood there watching. I ran. My training kicked in, but my instincts screamed that this wasn't something I could outrun. The mist swirled around me, and the woods seemed to close in, turning into a labyrinth. I tried to call for backup, but my radio was dead. The feeling of being hunted grew stronger with every step. Eventually, I stumbled upon an old path, one that didn't seem familiar. Desperation set in as I walked down it, hoping for some sign of safety. That's when I heard it, a voice, soft at first, whispering my name. It echoed through the trees, sending chills down my spine. I didn't stop. I couldn't. The voice grew louder, more urgent, but I kept running, pushing through the branches, the underbrush, anything to escape the oppressive presence that was chasing me. I don't remember how long it took me to finally get out of the forest. All I know is that when I stumbled out onto the main road, I was covered in sweat, my body shaking, and my mind reeling. I never looked back. To this day, I can't explain what happened that day. Was it the spirits of the land? Some ancient force I wasn't meant to understand? Or was it just the park playing tricks on my mind? All I know is that the Smoky Mountains are not just a place of natural beauty. There's something there, something dark and vengeful, and it doesn't take kindly to intruders. If you ever find yourself in that park, don't make the same mistake I did. The land doesn't forget, and neither do the things that dwell within it. Stay away from the Smoky Mountains. Trust me, you don't want to know what waits for you in the mist. The Smoky Mountains are more than just a place to escape the daily grind. They are ancient, a place where the land has witnessed countless stories, both ordinary and terrifying. I've spent years exploring the wilderness, often alone, surrounded by the quiet hum of nature. But there's a difference between the normal kind of solitude you find in the forests and something else. A darker silence that presses in on you like a physical weight, something I felt as soon as I stepped into the Smoky Mountains. The place has a reputation among park rangers, but it's the kind of reputation you brush off when you think of yourself as a seasoned veteran. There's a reason why some rangers steer clear of the area, and I'd come to learn it the hard way. Before that day, I had worked in national parks all over the country, each with its own beauty and unique challenges. But the Smoky Mountains were different. They were older, their history wrapped in layers of myth and mystery. The trees here are taller, the air thicker with fog, and the land has a way of hiding things, secrets that lie beneath the surface in the dense brush, the hidden caves, and the rivers that cut through the mountains like veins in a body. It's the kind of place that feels ancient, even timeless, and when you walk through the woods here, you can't help but wonder how many people have set foot on the same paths before you. But it's not just the trees or the landscape that make the Smoky Mountains special. It's the stories that haunt them, stories passed down through generations, tales that speak of things that should not be disturbed. I've never been one to give much credence to ghost stories or local legends, but there are some things in the Smoky Mountains that even I couldn't explain. There's a deep, almost primal energy to the place that calls out to you, whether you want to answer or not. Many visitors have come here, lured by its beauty, but few know of the darker side of the land. The locals call it the Forgotten Place, a spot in the forest where no one goes, not unless they want to be lost forever. They say it's where the spirits of the past are trapped, where the land itself punishes those who trespass on sacred ground. It's a rumor I'd heard from the moment I first entered the park, but like most rumors, I dismissed it. That was my mistake. I had been working as a park ranger in the Smoky Mountains for nearly a year before I ventured into the forest myself. I'd heard whispers of strange happenings, but they were just stories, nothing more. Then, when a few colleagues mentioned that I should visit the park's remote areas, I was intrigued. They spoke about the park's hidden beauty, the untouched parts that few ever see. I was curious but also skeptical. Most of my colleagues had a way of exaggerating things, so against my better judgment, I took their advice. I thought that maybe this place could offer something different from the usual trail I'd been walking. I couldn't have been more wrong. The moment I stepped off the familiar trails and into the deeper parts of the forest, something shifted. The world around me became quieter, not the serene kind of silence, but the kind that made your skin prickle and your heart race. The dense fog rolled in faster, obscuring everything beyond a few feet in front of me. My footsteps became muffled against the thick earth, and I could no longer hear the usual sounds of birds or the wind rustling through the leaves. It was as if the forest itself had closed its ears to me, as if everything had been muted. I knew something wasn't right, but at the time, I couldn't put my finger on it. I'd been in forests like this before, but the feeling here was different. It was like the trees themselves were alive, watching, waiting. I was no longer a park ranger walking through a forest. I felt like an intruder, like I wasn't supposed to be there. As I moved further in, the mist grew thicker, and the ground beneath my boots seemed to shift. At times, it almost felt like the earth itself was shifting beneath me, guiding me somewhere. I had to keep moving, compelled by some unknown force, something deep within the woods that urged me forward. As I made my way through the dense brush, I found myself at the foot of a small hill, covered in moss and vines. In the middle of it all was an old cabin, half collapsed, with a long abandoned look. My heart quickened as I approached. It wasn't on any maps, and no one had mentioned anything about a cabin in this part of the park. The moment I stepped inside, I knew something was wrong. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of rot. The walls of the cabin were lined with strange carvings, symbols I didn't recognize. The kind of markings you'd expect to see in ancient rituals, perhaps even something tied to old beliefs or superstitions. The journal I found inside, its pages fragile and worn with age, told me everything I needed to know about the place. It was written by someone who had been trapped here, someone who had ventured into the forest years before, and whose mind had slowly unraveled. The more I read, the more I understood that this place was cursed, not just with the spirits of the past, but with something darker, more insidious. The author spoke of being haunted by the very land, of feeling like they were being hunted by something they couldn't see. They spoke of the shadows, the whispers, the feeling of something watching them from the trees. I had heard rumors about the place, but reading those words brought a sense of dread I couldn't shake. I knew then that the Smoky Mountains were not just a national park. They were a place where something ancient, something vengeful, waited for those foolish enough to wander too far. I didn't know it at the time, but that was just the beginning of a nightmare that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The forest had begun to change me, and the worst was yet to come. The tension in the Smoky Mountains didn't hit me all at once. It crept up on me like the slow, suffocating fog that rolled through the trees, choking everything in its path. At first, I was too distracted by the eerie beauty of the place to notice. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their twisted limbs reaching into the sky like bony fingers, as though warning me to turn back. But I was already too deep into the forest, too far away from civilization to consider retreating. The first sign that something was wrong came when I decided to leave the cabin. I had spent hours reading the journal, absorbed in its dark recounting of events that mirrored the strange, unnerving feelings I was experiencing. The author spoke of voices in the wind, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight, and a sense of being watched, stalked even, by an unseen presence. Their words felt like a warning, but it wasn't until I tried to leave the cabin that I realized how true those warnings were. The path I had taken in was gone. At first, I assumed I was simply disoriented. I had wandered off the main trail and into the deeper parts of the woods, so it wasn't beyond reason that I had lost my bearings. But no matter which direction I turned, the landscape felt wrong, as if it had shifted around me. The trees were now closer, their trunks gnarled and twisted, as if they had grown to block my way. The mist hung thicker in the air, swirling in unnatural patterns, and the silence had grown oppressive. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, no sounds at all except for the distant, eerie whisper of the wind moving through the trees. It was the kind of silence that made your thoughts feel too loud, and I felt an unsettling shiver crawl down my spine. I had spent years in the wild, but this was something else entirely. I'd read enough about wilderness survival to know that disorientation in dense forests is common, but something in my gut told me this wasn't ordinary. I tried retracing my steps, but the terrain was changing before my eyes, the earth beneath my boots soft and treacherous, like it was trying to swallow me whole. And then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me. My heart stopped. I spun around, but there was no one there. The trees loomed large and still, but the sound had been real. The crunch of leaves underfoot, the rustle of branches, someone or something was following me. I quickened my pace, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. But no matter how fast I moved, the footsteps kept pace with me, always just out of sight. The shadows seemed to lengthen around me, reaching out like hands trying to grab hold. I pushed on, my mind racing. I couldn't explain what was happening. Had someone else gotten lost in these woods? Or had I crossed some kind of boundary, some invisible line where the forest itself had become hostile? The more I tried to rationalize it, the more the sense of dread seeped into my bones. This wasn't just a forest. It was alive in a way that I couldn't understand, and it was trying to tell me something. Maybe that journal hadn't been just a warning. It had been a map to something much darker. The fear began to spiral inside me, taking over every thought, every movement. I had to find my way out. I had to get back to the cabin, or at least find a trail that could lead me back to safety. I needed to get out of the grip of this place, but the more I moved, the more the world around me felt foreign. The trees were no longer the same. The hills seemed to shift, the landscape warping, as if the very fabric of reality had started to unravel. That's when I heard the whispering. It was so soft at first that I thought it was the wind, but there was something distinctly unnatural about the way it sounded. The whisper wasn't coming from a direction. It was all around me, coming from every direction at once. It felt like the forest itself was speaking, its words indecipherable but full of malice. I stopped dead in my tracks, straining my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It was then that I realized the forest wasn't trying to get rid of me. It was trying to draw me in, deeper into its heart. I stumbled backward, my instincts screaming at me to run, but every direction I turned felt wrong. The trees seemed to grow taller, the mist thicker, as if they were closing in on me, trapping me in a place I couldn't escape. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, and I could swear I could hear my name being called out. The sound wasn't human. It wasn't even natural. It was something ancient, something primal, and it made my blood run cold. I don't know how long I was lost in the woods, wandering in circles, trying to find a way out. The daylight began to fade, and the dark of night crept in with a suddenness that made my skin prickle. I had seen the sun setting, but it had never felt like this before. The shadows in the forest seemed to stretch longer, their reach extending beyond the trees, swallowing the last traces of light. And in that darkness, the whispers began again, louder now, almost suffocating. I knew I had to get out, but every step I took brought me closer to something else. Something waiting for me. It wasn't just the forest I was up against anymore. It was something else, something older, more powerful. And it wanted me. The journey through the Smoky Mountains was never supposed to be anything more than a routine patrol. But from the moment I crossed the threshold of the park, the shadows seemed to whisper and the trees grew taller, as if welcoming me into their tangled grip. My original mission was clear: inspect the area for any signs of illegal activity or disturbances in the ecosystem. But it quickly became apparent that something far darker was at play in this place. The first hint of something unnatural came after my interaction with the old man in the village. He had warned me about the park in a way that unsettled me deeply, and it wasn't just the stories he told. It was the way he spoke, the way his eyes darted nervously around us, as if he feared being overheard. "There's something in those mountains," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It isn't just the wildlife you have to worry about. You might encounter things you can't explain, things that can't be stopped." At the time, I dismissed it as a man's superstition, an old story meant to frighten tourists. But as I ventured further into the park, I began to understand that there was more to his words than I had initially thought. The first night I spent in the park, the subtle unease I'd felt throughout the day escalated. The night air was cold, and I had set up camp in a small clearing surrounded by thick forest. The woods were deathly quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. But as darkness fell, the silence deepened, becoming almost oppressive. The kind of silence where every footstep you take echoes like a drumbeat in your chest. The whispers started around midnight. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the creaking of branches, or the sound of small animals skittering through the underbrush. But as the minutes stretched on, I began to feel something different. The sounds were too deliberate, too rhythmic. It wasn't the forest making noise. It was something else, something trying to communicate. I stood up, my heart racing, and scanned the trees around me. I felt an overwhelming sense of being watched, as though every shadow had a pair of eyes fixed on me. But when I looked, there was nothing. The darkness seemed to stretch beyond the edge of the firelight, as if the very forest itself had come alive, watching and waiting. By the time I left my campsite the next morning, I was already beginning to question the sanity of continuing my patrol. My legs were stiff from lack of sleep, and I felt a sense of unease in my gut that I couldn't shake. I had been on enough solo missions to know that the mind plays tricks when you're isolated, but this felt different. The forest was playing its own tricks, and I was nothing more than a puppet in its tangled web. Over the next few days, I ventured deeper into the heart of the Smoky Mountains, where the land grew wilder, untouched by human hands. It was there, in the depths of the woods, that I found signs of the strange phenomena described in the journal. It wasn't just the isolated events of whispers in the dark or the feelings of being followed. No, it was much more than that. I came across strange markings on the trees, symbols etched into the bark in patterns I couldn't recognize. Some were simple scratches, while others were complex, almost ritualistic in nature. The deeper I went, the more frequent the markings became. It wasn't long before I realized that I was walking through a place that had been touched by something older than I could comprehend. But the real revelation came when I found the first remains. It was a body, partially decomposed, hanging from a tree. The sight of it made my stomach turn, and I had to fight the bile rising in my throat. The body was twisted and contorted, the limbs in unnatural positions, as if the person had been subjected to some horrific ritual before meeting their end. But it was the eyes that haunted me the most, wide open, staring at nothing, as if the soul of the deceased was trapped in that very spot. I knew then that the whispers were real, and they weren't just voices in the wind. There was someone, watching from the depths of the forest, pulling the strings of those foolish enough to venture too deep. It wasn't enough to make me turn back, though. My curiosity kept me moving forward, pushing through the rising dread that coiled tighter around my chest with every step. As I continued my journey, I encountered others who had fallen victim to whatever was lurking in the woods. One morning, I came across a man's tent, abandoned and shredded to pieces as if something had ripped through it. His belongings were scattered across the clearing, and there was no sign of him. No tracks leading away, no blood, nothing. Just the eerie emptiness of the forest swallowing him whole. That's when I realized the true horror of the Smoky Mountains. It was a place where the past bled into the present, where those who were lost were never truly gone. They were caught between worlds, condemned to wander the same twisted paths over and over, until they became part of the forest itself. I had become one of them, or so it felt. The more I ventured into the park, the more I felt the pull of its strange, malevolent energy. The forest wasn't just alive, it was alive with memories, with the souls of the lost, and it wanted me to join them. The turning point came when I encountered the group of hikers. They were a young couple, both in their late 20s, lost in the same maze of trails that I had been struggling to navigate. Their names were Emily and Ethan, and they seemed unaware of the dangers that loomed over us in the Smoky Mountains. They had been hiking for only a few days when I stumbled upon them, tired, disoriented, and not at all prepared for what lay ahead. When I first saw them, I was hesitant to approach. I had already started to question my own sanity, wondering if I had been imagining the strange events that were unfolding around me. The forest had a way of distorting reality, making you second-guess everything. But as I watched them, I saw that they were clearly lost, and I couldn't ignore the old duty within me to help. The moment I walked over to them, I noticed something was off. They were standing a little too close together, almost as if they were trying to protect one another from something unseen. They looked at me with a mix of relief and wariness, but there was an odd tension in the air that I couldn't shake. "We've been walking in circles for hours," Emily said, her voice strained. "We thought we were headed toward the ranger station, but we keep finding the same trail markers." I nodded, trying to keep my calm despite the gnawing dread in my chest. "I've been in these mountains a long time," I said, my voice steady. "I can help you find your way back." But there was no real comfort in my words. Not now. As I guided them through the woods, the strange energy of the forest began to close in around us, tightening like a noose. The temperature dropped sharply, and the silence grew deeper, more suffocating. The wind began to pick up, but there was no rustling of the trees, only an eerie stillness that pressed against our skin. We walked for what felt like hours, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly, as if we were walking in place. I could feel the weight of the forest around us, watching us, waiting. The more we moved forward, the more the woods seemed to close in, the trees forming dark silhouettes in the distance. The shadows twisted unnaturally, as if the forest itself was trying to hide something. It was then that I heard it, the whispering. At first, it was just a murmur, barely audible, as if carried by the wind. But as we continued, it grew louder. The voices were unmistakable, low, guttural sounds that didn't belong to any living creature. They were not human, but they carried the weight of centuries of sorrow, of pain, and of vengeance. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice a whisper, barely escaping my throat. Emily and Ethan exchanged uneasy glances. "What is it?" Ethan asked, his voice shaking. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't want to admit that something was out there, something ancient and malevolent. I didn't want to frighten them, but the truth was undeniable. We weren't alone, and the longer we stayed, the more the forest began to close in, trapping us within its dark heart. "We need to move quickly," I said, my voice urgent now. "We're not safe here." But as I turned to lead them, something stopped me. A figure appeared in the distance, tall, cloaked in shadow, its face hidden in darkness. It stood motionless, watching us. My first instinct was to run, to grab them and flee, but my legs were frozen. It was as if the forest itself had paralyzed me, holding me in place. "Stay back," I warned them, trying to stay calm. "Do not move." But it was too late. The figure moved toward us, its presence filling the air with an overwhelming sense of dread. Every step it took seemed to drain the light from the world, leaving only darkness in its wake. As it got closer, I could see it more clearly. Its form was human, but not entirely. Its body was twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, and its face, if you could call it that, was an expressionless mask of hollow eyes and a mouth stretched wide into an unholy grin. It spoke, its voice an unnatural croak. "You shouldn't have come." I wanted to run, to scream, but I was frozen, my legs unwilling to obey. The figure stepped closer, and the air grew colder, as though the very essence of life was being sucked away from the world around us. Ethan tried to back away, but the figure reached out with a long, spindly hand and grabbed him by the wrist. His scream echoed through the trees, but it was quickly silenced by the figure's other hand, which pressed against his mouth. His eyes widened in terror as the figure leaned in close, whispering something in his ear. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw the fear in his eyes, the way his body stiffened in terror. Before I could move, the figure released him, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. But something was wrong. His eyes, empty and hollow, stared up at me unseeing. "Ethan!" Emily screamed, but her voice was drowned out by the whispers of the forest. I turned to her, but she was already backing away, her eyes wide with terror. I reached for her, but it was too late. The shadows enveloped her, pulling her into the depths of the forest, and I could do nothing but watch as the darkness claimed her. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it was over. The figure was gone, and all that remained was the echo of the whispers, fading into nothingness. I stood alone in the cold, my heart racing in my chest. The forest had taken them, just as it had taken so many others before. And now it was coming for me. The aftermath of that encounter with the shadowy figure in the Smoky Mountains left me reeling, a shell of the man I once was. Emily and Ethan were gone, absorbed by the darkness of the forest, and I was left with only their screams echoing in my mind. I couldn't fathom what I had just witnessed, the terror of their disappearance still fresh in my mind like an open wound. For hours, I staggered through the woods, trying to regain my bearings, but it felt as though the forest had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, a place that no longer followed the rules of nature. I tried to call for help, but my voice seemed to be swallowed up by the thick trees and the dense fog that now clung to the ground like a living thing. I knew deep down that I could never return to the ranger's station. It would be useless. The forest had claimed its victims long before Emily and Ethan, and it would do the same to me if I didn't leave. But where could I go? There was nowhere safe. The whispers grew louder, closer, as if something or someone was following me, trailing behind in the shadows. I was being hunted, but by what? A creature? A force? Or was it something older? A presence that had existed long before humans had set foot in this place? As the hours dragged on, I found myself losing my grip on reality. I stumbled over roots, my legs weak from exhaustion, and every creaking branch or shifting shadow made my heart leap in fear. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, though I dared not turn around to look. The feeling of being pursued was overwhelming, suffocating. The forest was closing in on me, and I was trapped, a rat caught in its own maze. I tried to keep moving, but my pace slowed as fatigue set in. I knew that I couldn't go on much longer. The air was growing thicker, heavier, and it felt as though the very ground beneath me was alive, pulsating with some unnatural force. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer in the world I once knew, that I had crossed some invisible boundary into something far worse. And then, just when I thought I couldn't go on any further, I saw something ahead of me, a break in the trees, a glimmer of light. I pushed forward, summoning every last bit of energy to reach it. As I emerged from the woods, I found myself standing on the edge of a cliff, overlooking a vast valley below. It was a breathtaking sight, but there was no time to appreciate it. I could hear the whispers growing louder again, and this time, they weren't just voices, they were screams. My heart pounded in my chest, my breath shallow as I looked around frantically for some kind of escape. The forest was still closing in, its darkness creeping up to the edge of the cliff. I realized then that the mountain itself was trying to claim me. The ground was unstable, as though it was shifting, making it harder to stand firm. I knew I couldn't go back into the woods. I couldn't risk it. The only option left was to go forward, to climb down the side of the cliff into the valley below. It was dangerous, but it was my only chance. I turned and started scrambling down the cliff face, my hands slipping on the jagged rocks as I fought to maintain my grip. The fear in me was like a fire, pushing me forward with every step, and I didn't dare look back. The whispers followed me, louder now, as if they were coming from the very earth itself. When I finally reached the bottom, I collapsed in exhaustion, my hands raw from the climb. But I knew it wasn't over. The forest was still out there, still watching me, still waiting. The shadows weren't far behind. I didn't know how much longer I could keep going. The valley seemed endless, and the darkness was starting to swallow the light around me. But I couldn't stop now. I had to find a way out, had to find something, anything, to end this nightmare. I tried to keep moving, pushing through the thick underbrush, but with every step, I felt more and more disconnected from reality. The line between what was real and what was a product of my mind was blurring. I was so tired, so afraid, that I wasn't sure what was happening anymore. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the trees. I froze, my heart in my throat. It wasn't the figure from before, but it was something equally terrifying. A man, tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce right through me. His face was pale, nearly lifeless, and his clothes were tattered and torn as though he had been wandering these woods for years. "Help me," he rasped, his voice barely audible, like a whisper carried by the wind. I stepped forward, instinctively reaching out to him, but something stopped me. I felt a cold chill spread through my body, and I realized, too late, that I was not supposed to get any closer. The man's face twisted into a grotesque smile. "You should have never come here," he said, his voice now clearer, more powerful. "You'll never leave." You belong to the forest now." Before I could react, the man was gone, swallowed up by the trees. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, the sounds of the forest becoming a cacophony of voices, all of them screaming at me, accusing me, claiming me. I turned to run, but it was no use. The forest had me. The mountain had me. The only thing left was the dark, the endless darkness that was closing in around me, and the whispers that would haunt me forever. The Smoky Mountains, I realized then, were alive, and they were hungry. The next few days were a blur of disorientation and terror. The world around me had become a place where the rules no longer applied, where every step was filled with uncertainty. After my encounter with the figure at the cliff's edge, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was always watching me, always just a breath behind. The weight of the forest's malice bore down on me relentlessly, but I knew that if I allowed myself to give in to fear, I would never make it out alive. I tried to think back to my training as a ranger, the countless survival techniques I had learned over the years. But this wasn't a typical wilderness. The forest had its own set of rules, and it didn't seem to care much for anything I had learned. It felt as if the land itself was alive, with its own consciousness, its own hunger. But deep down, I knew that survival was still within my reach. I just had to adapt, to find a way to outwit the darkness that had claimed these woods. I had to keep moving. The first step in survival, I reminded myself, was to keep putting one foot in front of the other. I couldn't let myself become paralyzed by fear, as I had been during the earlier days of my ordeal. I needed to focus. I needed to be clear-headed. I knew that my chances of survival depended on my ability to think strategically. It wasn't easy. The woods around me were treacherous, and the sensation of being watched never left. Every sound, every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made my heart race. But as I moved deeper into the forest, I began to notice something. I wasn't alone. At first, it was subtle, a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, or a shadow darting across the edge of the path. But then it became clearer. I could hear footsteps behind me, quiet at first, but gradually growing louder. Not human footsteps, though. They were heavier, slower, like the thud of a beast stalking its prey. For hours, I could feel the presence of whatever was following me. It wasn't just a feeling of being watched. It was as though the forest itself was hunting me, trying to trap me in its endless maze of trees and fog. The terrain grew more difficult. Steep inclines, thick brambles, and jagged rocks that seemed to appear out of nowhere. The forest seemed to shift as I moved, as if it were actively trying to confuse me, to lead me further into its depths. But I pushed on. I had no other choice. Then it happened. In a moment of clarity, a realization hit me like a bolt of lightning. This was a battle of wills. The forest was feeding on my fear, my doubt, my exhaustion. Every time I stumbled, every time I hesitated, the forest gained ground. But if I could suppress my fear, if I could force myself to push through it, maybe, just maybe, I could break free from its hold. I thought back to everything I had learned in my years as a ranger. One of the most important lessons had always been about the mental state of survival. It wasn't enough to be physically prepared. You had to be mentally sharp, focused. In the wild, everything depended on your mind as much as your body. So I focused. I forced myself to breathe steadily, to clear the fog of panic from my thoughts. I stopped looking over my shoulder, refusing to acknowledge the thing that was stalking me in the darkness. Instead, I began to scan the surroundings, focusing on the path ahead, trying to map out my route. I used all of my instincts, all of my training, to navigate through the forest. Slowly, the terrifying pressure that had weighed down on me began to ease. I was no longer running from something. I was moving with purpose, actively making decisions, choosing where to go next. But then the forest did something that shook me to my core. The air grew cold, unnaturally cold, like a chill that settled deep into my bones. It wasn't just the drop in temperature. It was the sense of something encroaching, something dark and ancient. The trees around me started to change. Their trunks twisted and warped, and the shadows between them seemed to lengthen, as if the night was swallowing the daylight itself. I had to act quickly. This was it, the moment of truth. With every ounce of strength I had left, I forced myself to sprint, my breath ragged in my chest. I had no idea where I was going, only that I had to get out. I pushed myself to the limit, ignoring the pain in my legs and the tightness in my chest. Behind me, the footsteps grew louder, and I could feel the thing that was hunting me closing in. But then, just as I thought I was going to collapse, I saw it, a break in the trees ahead. A clearing, a place of light. I ran toward it, faster than I had ever run before, my heart pounding in my ears. And when I emerged into the clearing, I stopped dead in my tracks. The forest had stopped. The air was still. The ground was firm beneath my feet, and the oppressive sense of being hunted seemed to lift. For the first time in days, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in all this time: relief. I had made it. I had fought the forest and survived. But it wasn't over yet. The forest was still out there, waiting, and I knew that whatever had been chasing me would never truly stop hunting. The truth was, I hadn't escaped the Smoky Mountains. I had simply learned how to survive in it. It had tested me, pushed me to my limits, but I had come out the other side stronger for it. I wasn't the same person who had entered those woods. And as I stood there, breathing in the fresh air of the clearing, I realized that I had won. The forest hadn't claimed me. I had claimed it. I had learned the most important lesson of all. Survival wasn't just about strength or preparation. It was about resilience, about never giving up, no matter what horrors you faced. I would never forget the terror of the Smoky Mountains, but I would also never let it define me. The forest had shown me the depths of fear, but it had also shown me the depths of my own strength. And with that, I knew I was ready for whatever came next. The days that followed my harrowing encounter at the edge of the Smoky Mountains were a strange mix of exhaustion, fear, and disbelief. Every step I took, every breath I drew, seemed weighted with the knowledge that the forest was far from done with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching me, its presence lingering like a shadow just beyond my reach. The winds had changed, and the silence was deafening, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the snap of a twig underfoot. The forest wasn't just a place. It had become a presence, an entity with an almost malicious intent. I had heard rumors about the Smoky Mountains, legends of disappearances, of strange happenings in the deep forests. The place had a reputation, a dark one that seemed to haunt every step I took through it. But I had dismissed it all as superstition, the type of stories that old-timers tell around campfires to scare the young ones. Now, standing in the heart of that vast wilderness, I knew the truth. The Smoky Mountains were more than just a collection of trees and rocks. They were alive with something ancient, something that thrived on fear. I had barely made it through the first night after my encounter at the cliff, and already, the pressure of the forest was beginning to break me. My muscles ached from the continuous trek, and my mind felt fogged by a constant sense of dread. Every time I closed my eyes, the memory of that figure staring at me from the distance flashed before me, and the chill that had settled in my bones never left. But worse than that was the sense of being hunted, of something following me through the trees, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was no longer just about survival. I wasn't simply trying to make it out of the mountains. I was trying to understand what the forest wanted from me, what it was willing to do to claim me, what I had to do to keep myself safe. Every ranger instinct in my body screamed at me to keep moving, to find a way out, but I knew deep down that running wouldn't be enough. This place had a hold on me, and if I didn't confront it head-on, I might never leave alive. The stories I had heard were no longer just stories. They were warnings, and now they were my reality. There was a certain logic to the madness that had gripped me in the past few days. In the heart of the forest, I had learned to survive, to adapt. But now, as the oppressive weight of the Smoky Mountains bore down on me, I realized that survival alone wouldn't be enough. I had to face what was coming. I had to prepare for what I knew was inevitable. I spent my nights awake, listening to the sounds around me. The crunching of leaves, the snapping of branches, the distant howls that echoed through the trees. There was a rhythm to it all, something unsettlingly familiar, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. The forest wasn't just a place. It was a living, breathing entity, and I was nothing more than an intruder in its domain. But there was a glimmer of hope, a faint thread of reason that pushed through the fog of fear. I had been trained for situations like this, even though I had never imagined that I would have to face something so unnatural. My training had focused on navigating dense forests, on tracking animals, and on surviving in harsh conditions, but it had never prepared me for something like the Smoky Mountains. No ranger manual had warned me about an ancient force that fed on fear and darkness. Still, I clung to the training I had. Every ranger is taught to trust their instincts, to read the signs that the land provides. So I started paying attention to the small details, the way the trees leaned unnaturally in one direction, the strange gaps in the forest floor that seemed to swallow up light, the shadows that didn't quite line up with the physical world. There was something in the way the forest seemed to pulse with life, as if it were a living organism with a singular purpose, to claim me. And then I remembered the stories, the ones I had dismissed as superstition. the ones that spoke of lost souls and the mountain spirits that called the Smoky Mountains home. I had scoffed at them once, but now they seemed to hold the key to my survival. I needed to understand what had happened here, what had driven people mad, what had caused so many to disappear. The forest had a story to tell, and if I wanted to make it out alive, I had to listen. As I pressed deeper into the mountains, I started to notice something else. The landscape was changing. The trees were growing denser, their branches twisting in strange shapes, their bark gnarled and dark. The path I had been following seemed to disappear, swallowed by the dense underbrush. And the air grew heavier, thick with an oppressive force that I couldn't explain. My mind raced as I realized that I was no longer just walking through the forest. I was entering its heart. It was then that I heard the voices. At first, they were faint, whispers that danced on the edge of my hearing. They seemed to come from the very ground beneath me, from the trees themselves. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, a warning, a command. I had crossed some invisible threshold, and the forest was calling me deeper into its grasp. I stood there for a moment, torn between the urge to turn back and the compulsion to continue. The forest was no longer just an environment. It was a living, breathing entity that demanded my presence. If I wanted to survive, I had no choice but to face it head-on. I steeled myself. I knew what was coming. It was the final test, the moment when the forest would demand everything from me. There was no turning back now. I had to face the darkness, to confront whatever ancient force had claimed the Smoky Mountains as its own. And with that, I took my first step toward the inevitable showdown that would determine my fate. The deeper I ventured into the Smoky Mountains, the more the atmosphere seemed to press in on me. The air grew heavier, the trees darker, and the silence, well, it became deafening. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of animals or the wind rustling through the branches. Everything around me felt stifled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I had passed the point of no return. There was no turning back now. The whispers had become more distinct, clearer now, almost like a voice in my ear, echoing from the shadows. I could feel the presence of something ancient, something alive, in the very soil beneath my boots. The stories I'd heard in passing, the rumors of a dark force in these mountains, they all started to piece together in my mind. This wasn't just a forest. This was a place cursed by something older than time itself. And whatever it was, it had no intention of letting me leave. At first, I thought the figure I'd seen at the cliff was just a figment of my imagination, a hallucination brought on by fatigue and fear. But now, as I pressed forward, I began to feel its presence again. It was as if it was always just behind me, never quite seen but always there, watching, waiting. Every rustle of a leaf, every snap of a branch made my heart race. The forest seemed to be alive with the promise of something waiting for me, something that was always just out of reach. I stumbled upon an area in the forest that seemed different. The trees here were twisted, their roots sprawling unnaturally across the ground, as if they were reaching for something. The air felt cold, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the very land itself was alive, its pulse beating in rhythm with my own. As I moved through the eerie landscape, I could almost feel the earth beneath my feet shifting, as if the ground itself was trying to swallow me whole. That's when I saw it again, the figure. It was standing motionless between two ancient oaks, its shape barely visible in the gloom. The shadows clung to it like a second skin, distorting its form until it seemed more like a wisp of smoke than a person. But the eyes, they burned through the darkness like twin lanterns, cold and filled with malice. My blood ran cold, and for a moment I was paralyzed. I knew then that it wasn't just a person. It wasn't human. The forest seemed to react to my fear, the trees shaking as though the very ground was disturbed by my presence. I couldn't move, couldn't look away from those eyes. They were full of something ancient, something unforgiving. The figure stepped closer, its movements unnaturally slow, deliberate, and each step sent a tremor through the ground. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure whispered, its voice like gravel being ground underfoot. It was speaking directly to me, its tone like a warning and a curse. "Who are you?" I managed to force out, my voice shaking with a mixture of fear and defiance. The figure tilted its head slightly, a grotesque, mocking smile curling at the corners of its lips. It didn't answer me, but the air around it seemed to grow colder, and the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. I had no doubt now that it wasn't just watching me. It was waiting for me to make a move. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. It was like a blur, its form distorting and shifting in the blink of an eye. It was faster than any human should be, its movements unnaturally fluid, its limbs elongated. I didn't have time to react. I only knew that I had to survive. My instincts as a ranger kicked in. I grabbed the nearest branch and swung it toward the figure, hoping to make contact, but it passed right through it. There was no solid form, just an endless void where it should have been. Panic surged in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself. I spun on my heels and ran, my feet pounding against the earth, my heart hammering in my chest. The ground seemed to shift beneath me, and I had the sinking feeling that the forest was now working against me, leading me deeper into its embrace. I heard the figure's voice again, but now it was inside my head, reverberating through my skull. It wasn't speaking words, it was just pure, suffocating malice. Asterisk, you can't escape. Not now. Not ever. Asterisk. I didn't dare look back, but the sounds of footsteps, thudding, relentless, grew louder behind me. Each step sent tremors through the earth, and I could feel the air growing thick with tension, like the forest was closing in around me. Every shadow seemed to twist, every tree seemed to lean toward me, as if the entire forest was a living, breathing thing that wanted to drag me into the ground. I stumbled, my foot catching on a root, and I fell hard onto the ground. Pain shot through my body, but I didn't stop. I pushed myself up and continued to run, even though every ounce of my being screamed to stop. The figure was getting closer. I could feel it, the cold breath of death nipping at my heels. Then I saw it. The cliff. The same one I had been at earlier, the one where I had barely escaped with my life. But now, it wasn't just a place. It was my salvation. With everything I had left, I pushed toward the edge of the cliff. I didn't look back. The air was thick with the presence of the thing chasing me, but I knew that if I could just reach the edge, if I could just leap over it, maybe I could escape, maybe I could leave this nightmare behind. I took a deep breath and sprinted toward the precipice, and in that moment, everything seemed to freeze. The figure's voice, the crashing footsteps, the oppressive weight of the forest, they all stopped. The silence was suffocating, and for the briefest second, I thought I might actually make it out. But then the ground beneath me gave way. I fell. I woke up with a sharp pain coursing through my body, the sensation of being weightless quickly replaced by the sharp sting of the ground beneath me. I had no idea how far I'd fallen, but it was enough to leave me winded and disoriented. My limbs felt like lead, my body bruised and battered. I tried to move, but the pain in my chest and back held me down. I could hear the echoes of my own breath in the silence, and the stillness around me only deepened my terror. The forest was still alive, and it had not released me. It took a while for my vision to clear, for my mind to catch up with the gravity of what had just happened. The figure, the thing that had been chasing me, hadn't followed. Or at least, I didn't think it had. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still here, somewhere just out of sight, waiting for me to move, to make a sound. I had narrowly escaped whatever dark force haunted these woods, but I was far from free. The forest was alive, pulsing with an unnatural energy that made it feel like the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting to swallow me whole. I slowly rose to my feet, my body protesting with each movement. I could barely stand, let alone run. My head throbbed, and I felt a disorienting dizziness as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The trees, twisted and grotesque, seemed to loom over me, their branches reaching down like hands, as if they were waiting for me to make the wrong move. In the distance, I could see the outline of the trail. A weak sliver of hope sparked in my chest, the possibility that I might still make it out of this forest alive. But I knew better. This place had a way of twisting reality, of luring you in with the promise of safety before consuming you whole. I stumbled forward, my legs barely carrying me, and the weight of what had happened began to settle in. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't just fallen into a ravine, but into a trap set by something far older than me, something that had been waiting for me. The whispers I had heard earlier came rushing back. Asterisk, you can't escape. Not now. Not ever. Asterisk. As I walked, I felt the weight of the forest pressing in on me. The branches above creaked and groaned, the ground shifted beneath my feet, and every corner seemed to hide something just beyond the edge of my vision. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, never left me. I couldn't help but wonder, had I really escaped? Or was this just the beginning? The Smoky Mountains had taken something from me, something I couldn't explain. It had changed me, twisted me in ways that I couldn't comprehend. The shadows of that place were still with me, whispering, calling, urging me to return. I don't know if I'll ever be able to leave the mountain behind. I don't know if I'll ever be free from the pull of the forest. The days since I left have blurred together. I'm no longer sure what's real and what isn't. The nightmares, the voices, the lingering sense that something is following me have all become a part of my daily life. I can still hear the figure's voice, still see those haunting eyes, still feel the cold breath of the forest on my neck. I know now that the Smoky Mountains are not just a place. They are a force, ancient, unforgiving, and relentless. And no matter how far I run, no matter how many miles I put between myself and that cursed forest, I will never be free of it. It has marked me. It has claimed a part of me that I can never get back. And the worst part, I'm not sure if I want to. Because even though it has taken everything from me, even though it has changed me beyond recognition, a part of me, deep inside, longs to return. To confront the thing that nearly killed me, to understand it, to know what it was that nearly destroyed my life. Perhaps the Smoky Mountains have become my prison, or maybe, just maybe, it's become my calling. Months have passed since I escaped the Smoky Mountains, but the scars, both physical and mental, remain. I still hear the whispers in the dark, feel the eyes watching me from the shadows. The nightmares are relentless, but I can't stop searching for answers. What was that thing in the forest? Why did it spare me, and what does it want? I've left my old life behind, but I'm haunted by the truth that I can never truly escape. The forest has its grip on me, and I fear that one day it will call me back, whether I'm ready or not. If my story has left you uneasy, take it as a warning. The Smoky Mountains, and places like it, hide more than just wildlife. They harbor secrets that should never be uncovered. If you ever find yourself drawn to these dark corners of the world, think twice. Curiosity killed more than just the cat. It leaves lasting scars that never truly heal. Stay away from places that aren't meant to be explored, especially the ones where the land itself seems to remember. Listen to the stories, but don't make the mistake of becoming part of them.